Hi, thanks for viewing my workshop. I'm Dan Hickey. I'm a professor with the Learning Sciences program. I'm with Indiana University. This work was done in collaboration with Indiana University High School. This is the third in three workshops carried out with the Indiana Learning Lab, and it was presented on May 3rd, 2022. Big thanks to Governor Eric Holcomb. This work was supported in part by the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund, additional support from Charity Flores and the Indiana Department of Education. This work was funded through Michael Beam's office, the Office of School Partnerships at Indiana University, and a huge thanks to the support of Jenna Langell at the Five Star Technology Solutions, who were responsible for the broader series of workshops. Also want to say thanks to my current and former PhD students in the Learning Sciences program who have been invaluable in this work. To reiterate, this is the third in a series of three workshops. The first one on March 29th was responsive engagement with social annotation. The second was virtual formative assessment, and then today's is virtual summative assessment. Each of these workshops correspond with one module in the responsive engagement and virtual learner assessment, or REVLA course, a longer course that is much more comprehensive. The REVLA in Canvas LMS will require an IU guest login. That's easy to obtain. And the version in Google Classrooms is available as well. These are worth 8 Indiana professional growth points. And these classes are important because they use a format that we're pretty excited about. It's this kind of learn, experience, template, steps format that we call it. So the most important thing is before you learn to create assignments or assessments, you experience them so that they make a lot more sense, and then we provide you templates and step-by-step guidelines for doing so. All of the information, including the links to those courses, are at the landing page. There you can see it right there. That'll be displayed at the bottom of most of the slides going forward. I'm pretty sure that most of you are familiar with the distinction between formative and summative assessment and can appreciate that those are different levels of assessment, in that the summative assessments typically are more formal than formative assessments. Well, I've expanded that out in my career, and I've really focused on this multi-level assessment, and really there are 4 different levels and stretched across these workshops. There's informal feedback on annotations and artifacts in terms of instructor comments in workshop 1. There's reflections and formative self-assessments in workshop 2. And then finally in this workshop is really the 4th level. And what we're really trying to do here is align learning across these levels, but without teaching to the test. The time scale of learning represented at each level is longer and longer, and the representations are more formal and more systematic. And this is a way of ensuring high achievement without teaching to the test, without compromising the evidence. And this allows an assessment, a formative assessment, to be formative for current understanding, but summative of their prior engagement. And that reflects a broader sociocultural theory of learning. So I'd like to briefly introduce you to 3 core summative assessment principles. The first one is reliability. Reliability is often confused with validity. They are different things. Reliability refers to the consistency of scores and whether or not students either get the same score on similar items or the same score on the same item when that item is completed over time. It is a property of an assessment. You can characterize an assessment as being reliable. Generally, this is not a huge concern for educators. Validity, on the other hand, is not a property of an assessment. It's a property of evidence. Evidence can be more or less valid for supporting a particular claim. When someone characterizes and uses the word valid assessment, they're demonstrating they don't understand validity, because there is no such thing as a valid assessment. Cheating is a very big threat to the validity of virtual assessments. There are different kinds of validity evidence. The most important kind of validity evidence for most educators and most of you is content-related validity evidence. And that's the kind of evidence that your assessment is valid evidence of mastery of the content of your instruction. And so if you look over there on the right, you can see that an assessment on the upper left, it can be reliable in that students can get consistent scores, but still not be valid because those scores aren't sort of on the target. Or on the right, it can be not reliable, right? They're sort of all over the place, and therefore, by definition, not valid. You see on the left, neither reliable nor valid. But on the right, you can see that when the scores are targeting tightly on the cluster, that is both reliable and valid. Bias, on the other hand, refers to items or tests that discriminate against groups. Gender and race are the most obvious targets. Boy, in the 70s, they used kindergarten readiness tests that included stuff like whether or not a saucer goes with a teacup. And needless to say, many students from poorer communities didn't have any experience with a teacup. And in fact, they would say that, oh no, that cup is what we use to scoop soup out of a pot, right? And so that led to really, generations of students of color being held back a year or two from kindergarten, and it had really drastic consequences later when those students were in high school. Similarly, this item you see here was an actual item from the SAT. The correct answer is runner is the marathon, is oarsman is the regatta. Well, it's a pretty specialized subset of students who've been exposed to oarsmen and regatta and that relationship. Now, these kinds of egregious errors are removed from high stakes tests using differential item functioning, and it tells you whether an item functions differently for a group than it should overall. You don't have access to this as an educator. In my experience, a lot of educators will make pretty big mistakes. Either they'll use an item that's offensive, or they will often resort to stereotypes when creating items, and that really should be avoided. Okay, so I'm going to make a point here. I'm going to make a couple of points here that are really important. I'm going to return to these points because they might be a little confusing to you, but I also want to do a little quiz here. So I'm going to ask you to take a minute and read these items and see if you can figure out which the correct answer is for each of them. Which one of the following statements could be technically correct? Okay. Okay, most of you probably figured out that the correct answer is A. The test-based inference is valid. Notice the other three all say that the test is valid. They characterize this test as valid. Right? And then for question 6, classroom teachers are most apt to focus on which of the following? Right? Most of you probably got test content evidence of validity because that is the direct answer that I just told you. Now, I want to make a couple of points here with these items. These items were chosen to make these points. The first is, on one hand, these items are might be hard to look up because a student would have to look up all 4 of those responses, right? That's a different structure. Many items you can search for the stem, right? It's obvious that if you ask Google the question that's in the stem, Google will return the answer. However, if you look at these items, you can see that many knowledgeable adults could figure out which one is correct simply by process of elimination, by looking at the items, just by the wording of the items. It's especially apparent on question 6, in that 3 of them, A, B, and C, all have the word reliability in them, whereas the third one. So these are medium difficulty items. They're not very searchable unless someone has posted the actual item to the web. So let's take a look at what happens. When I went to search for the first item there, you can see that Google actually anticipated the rest of the question as its very first response. And this is because of the magic of JSON linked data, JavaScript object notation. It's magic to me, but what it really means when that tells us that lots of people are searching for that exact thing. And that's why Google can fill it in. And that means it's pretty likely that the answer is going to be out there. And indeed, if we click on that first link, we see that Quizlet, Chegg, And this study, all three of them have the actual item. And that's because that is the original item that was taken from the item bank from a very popular textbook, the most popular textbook at all. So the point here is that Googling items is a big issue. It's a big threat to the validity of your items. Um, you almost always have to rewrite them, even if they're your own items. Your students may well post them as well. So you really want to check and see. Um, Now, another point though is when you're using item bank items in particular, not only do you have to rewrite the stem of the item, you have to rewrite the answer. There you see I put the first response in the thing, and indeed it goes right to Quizlet and finds the item. That's how good Google is, and that's how compromised these items are. Students know how to find these things, and I'm going to return to this. So I want to step back and take a minute and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of virtual summative assessment. Um, Using technology allows automated scoring, which is a tremendous advantage because it saves you a lot of time. Um, Now, if you're online, you can't administer closed book exams without some extra work. Digital proctors are available. They have serious limitations. They're expensive and intrusive, and many students know how to bypass them. In my opinion, you're much better off following my advice and using time-limited assessments that can't be looked up in the time presented, rather than thinking that you can keep your students from looking up answers. It's really hard to stop. I don't trust the proctors. Many people don't. If you just search on the web, as I have, there's just tons of examples of ways to get around them. This workshop is going to focus on selected response and fill in the blank items. Those are the two formats that learning management systems can automatically score. Um, in my opinion, short answer formats are best for formative self-assessments, and portfolio assessments are really best for completion grading rather than grading them for evidence of student mastery. So your learning management systems, Canvas and primarily Canvas and Google Classrooms with Forms, are the ones that most of you are probably using and have access to. Again, they can automatically score selected response and fill in the blank items, but they really streamline the scoring of short answer and essay items, and it's easy to include time limits. The disadvantage is their power. Canvas has 10 item formats and 4 quiz types. That's 40 different combinations, and that can be really overwhelming. Uh, the Revla workshop is intended to tame that complexity. These combinations work differently in formative versus summative. As I'll show you at the end of the talk, LMSs also have item analyses tools that can be incredibly helpful in creating assessments. So these are the 4 quiz formats in Canvas. We're going to focus on graded quizzes. When you use a graded quiz, it creates a column in the Canvas gradebook. These are usually used for summative assessments, but you can still provide formative feedback to support your students. And this raises a really important question of whether or not you're going to tell your students whether they got the items correct. It has some formative functions, but it also runs the risk of compromising your quizzes. And this depends on a lot of other factors. There are 10 different item formats in Canvas. Again, we're going to focus today on selected response. This includes true, false, and multiple choice, and fill in the blank. Now, fill in the blank, you have to give the quiz engine all of the possible responses, and this can include misspellings, caps, and things like that. Again, we're not going to talk about constructed response in these other more sophisticated formats that are more work. Importantly, the settings in Canvas, again, I'm going to focus on Canvas. Some of these functions are available in Google Forms, which is really kind of a stripped down version of Canvas Quiz Engine. Shuffling answers, that gives them in different order. It makes it harder for students to just share the answers in forms of a number of an item and the letter of the correct response or the sequence. Time limits, this will automatically submit the quiz when the time runs out. If you are using time limits, the appropriate length of time depends on a lot of other factors. Multiple attempts is a big one. If you let students take the quizzes multiple times, they may resort to guess and check. That's an important question. Letting students see the responses. This is probably the touchiest one. Students want to know whether they got each item right and will often argue with you that, they were sure that two answers were correct. Now, if you don't present them with the answers, it really helps keep your quizzes secure. Show one question at a time. Again, it's harder for students to print out the entire quiz. Um, which helps security, but it also makes it harder for students to allocate their time of going back and forth and reviewing items. So let's return to this question of the searchability of items. Let's start with some simple items. So here's an example item. How fast do typical fingernails grow? Well, you, you right, if you ask Google that question, the answer appears right there. Now, in this case, they're going to have to convert millimeters to inches. Most students know how to do that. That is a problematic item in that, students can just ask Google and Google will answer their question. Likewise, here's another question. What do sociologists study? And we see that this is popping up right on top of the browser. Human behavior, interaction, and organization. So you can pretty much infer from the information given uh, that the correct answer is society and how people behave. Now, importantly, what you see at the bottom are these people also ask, and this is where Google can really compromise your item because students will scour those people also ask for other versions of the same question. So let's revisit this question of obtained items. The items I showed you previously, those were obtained from the item bank. In this case, I have an item that I obtained from the web, from the Pew Research Center. And you'll notice that not only did I go back to the original question at the Pew Research Center to answer the question, but also these other quizzes also had the item in there. So that's not a very good item. It's very easily searchable. However, when I rewrite the item to be about psoriasis, right, this exact same structure, notice that it took me to information about psoriasis, and importantly, the people also asked doesn't come anywhere near answering the question. So this item is no longer searchable, and it would be almost impossible to find the correct answer for this on the web, and a student would be very likely to get this wrong if they hadn't learned that content when you were during instruction. Now, this is a more complex item in that again, a student would have to search all four of those responses to find the answer. You notice that when I put the stem in, the answer didn't come up, and there's nothing in the people also ask, and you would literally have to go through and look up and understand conflict theory right? You have to look up all four of them, at least until you got to one that was clearly the correct answer. Now, the key point here is that the student who did study these things and learned these differences in these theories might check their understanding in Google, but if they hadn't studied them, it would be very difficult for them to solve this item with no prior knowledge in 2 minutes or so. So that's an example of a pretty good item. Now here's an interesting little trick I learned recently. I haven't put this to practice yet, but I was intrigued by it, and that is another test security scholar did a podcast, and he suggested that if you include references to popular culture in your quiz items, it floods the browser search with references to that. And there you see, I've said, if Harry Potter was a sociologist, and indeed you can see that everything's about Harry Potter rather than about the sociologist. And so now your students might be able to figure out that they would remove Harry Potter from there, but it's a little trick that might help. I'm interested in exploring this a little more in my own work. So that is it for the core of the talk. Those are some lessons. There's more to learn in the module in the Revla workshop. I'll close by talking about what you can learn using the item analysis tools that are available both in Canvas as well as in Google Forms. This is your quiz summary, your quiz statistics, and you can see here this is the actual exam from my Assessment in Schools course from Module 2, where I just drew those items from, and you can see that the average is around 82%. Now, right, that's roughly a B, below B, a B minus. However, as I explained in my previous workshop, one of my principles is that your summative assessments should be discrete. They shouldn't be worth a lot of points. And in my case, uh, I have 3 exams. They're each worth 10 out of 100 points. And so the 3 exams together only comprise 30% of their score. Now, a student who gets 45%, as one of the students did here, that's going to drag their grade down. They're not going to get an A in this class. They're going to get a B, and if they do that poorly, right? So you want to get this right, but you don't want all of your students getting most of your items right. You want to have a nice, roughly normal distribution, maybe 1 or 0 students getting a perfect score. If you have a lot of students getting an item correct, if all of your students get an item correct, you're not really discriminating from the students who know more than the other students, and that's what summative assessments do. They're comparing how much students know. Now, um, of course, the amount of knowledge students brought into the course has a lot to do with how they score on these exams, and that's why you really don't want to make, in my opinion, a final exam worth really many more points. Now, this is item analysis. So this is a function within your learning management system. D, or discrimination, is a really important thing. This will be a little confusing, but bear with me. You can see here that 75% of the students got the item correct, right? That means the P, or the difficulty of the item, is 75%, a little bit below the mean. So this is not an easy item. A quarter of the students missed the item. Two things to note here is that the missed items are spread. Those are good distractors in that no one jumped out at the students. What's more important is that is a very high discrimination index, and that is because those 4 students who got this item right did much worse on the assessment than the 12 students who got it correct. So that means that this item is discriminating students. If your Ds are below about 0.20, they're going to be flagged, and that tells you that that item really isn't related to how students did on the items overall. So it's important to have high D. Once you get below about 0.2, that'll actually be in red and tell you this is probably a problematic item, and you're going to want to look at it and figure out why. So that's mostly it for this workshop. You can get started yourself. You should go to the Revla course. There you see again, there's the landing page at bit.ly/IDOE workshop. Uh, There's the templates and their resources on the landing page. You should find those very helpful. There are also several articles available at the landing page. I encourage you to start with the Hickey Duncan et al., that is with Jody Duncan and other teachers from Indiana University High School who we've been working with for many years. It's a very, very good, very basic introduction to this broader approach that we teach you in the Revla course. The second paper, Hickey, Chartrand, and Andrews, was much longer. It's written for instructional designers, and that actually shows how we took the design principles that are rooted in situative theories of learning and translated them into steps for instructional designers. And then Hickey and Harris 21 was written specifically for the assessment community. I want to encourage you to search the web for free and paid resources. Teacher Pay Teachers, turns out, has some very good summative assessments. But remember that if you can find the items, your students probably can find those items as well. So thank you very much. My email address is dthickey@indiana.edu. You can see it there on that slide. If you have questions, don't hesitate to email me. Love to talk to people, love to learn who's watching these things, and maybe we'll see you in the Revla course. Thank you very much for your time.